On today's episode, we're continuing our conversation from last week where we asked, what does retirement failure look like and how can we avoid it? Let's identify all the risks we might face or ways we might fail, and only then decide the positive actions we should take to mitigate those risks.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 141. I'm Jesse Kramer. I'm a financial planner and I work with retirees and busy professionals preparing for retirement across the USA. You can learn more at planwithjesse.com. This week's review of the week is from Ethan Gilbert, who left kind words and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. So Ethan, drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog and I'll get you hooked up with a super soft podcast t-shirt. We'll mail it out to you. And now on with the show. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, that's episode 140, please go listen to that one. That episode is really part 1 to today's part 2. And in part 1, I kind of introduced this entire exercise and also discussed the first 7 key retirement risks and what we can do to combat those risks. Specifically, I spoke about longevity risk, inflation risk, partner or household risk, market risk, sequence of returns risk, withdrawal risk, and then health risk in general. Continuing on to today's episode, I'm going to dive into long-term care or other shock spending risk, cognitive decline risk, behavioral risk, assumptions risk, policy or legislation risk, identity and purpose risk, and then last, the deep risks. And enough preamble, let's just dive in. So I'm going to start today talking about shock spending and long-term care risk. Shock spending as a general term describes where some sort of unforeseen circumstances means we are going to spend a really big amount of money all at once. And throughout most of our lives, these spending shocks might be something like medical expenses causing us to max out our $10,000 insurance deductible, for example, or a mini housing disaster causing us to max out our homeowner's deductible. Something happens to a spouse, a child, or some other relative causing you to spend a lot of money all at once. And these shocks are no fun. That said, a healthy emergency fund and proper insurance coverage kind of dampens the blow. Without that emergency fund or the insurance coverage, these kind of spending shocks can begin a slippery slope into some of the really bad financial situations that we hear horror stories about. But again, this is why emergency funds or proper insurance coverage are 2 of the pillars, 2 of the first steps of basic personal finance priorities. Now, in retirement, those same shocks could certainly apply. It's no fun replacing your roof if you weren't expecting it, whether you're working or retired. But there are 3 major types of spending shocks that tend to occur maybe more frequently for retirees than they occur for other people. They are 1, healthcare costs in the gap years before Medicare. Number 2, supporting an adult child. And number 3, long-term care. Healthcare costs in the gap year before Medicare. Let's talk about that one first. Medicare starts at age 65, and retirees who retire earlier than age 65, they do have a few different ways they can fill in the healthcare gap until Medicare kicks in. Now, in episode 108 of this podcast, I spent a good 25 minutes tackling this very idea. And rather than spending 25 minutes here, again, I recommend you add that to your listening list. Again, that was episode 108. So now we'll move on to supporting an adult child. Now, unfortunately, there's very little you can do to prepare or de-risk yourself from this occurring. It's one of those things that's both very unique to your circumstances and that nobody, such as an insurance company, is going to help you out with. The only thing I can say here is to offer some very similar one-liner that I think it applies to when it comes to helping your kids with college, for example, is that you can get a loan for college, you can't get a loan for your retirement. Now, if your adult child is in trouble, they might not be able to bail themselves out. But one thing I know for sure is that you cannot get a loan to bail yourself out if your retirement funds run dry. So that's why, from a kind of cold financial point of view, we do want to be cautious about mortgaging our own retirement requirements to bail out an adult child in some way. Or perhaps a better way to put it is you really want to understand the cold financial math before you make what is obviously going to be a challenging emotional decision to help your child. And if you make that emotional decision without first digging into the cold finances, I do think you are doing your future self a bit of a disservice. But that brings me to the third one, long-term care. Now, long-term care is scary for a few reasons. Now, first, there's the human side of it. Long-term care is a depressing topic for many people because it represents some loss of control or autonomy, a loss of the familiar daily routines. It signifies for many people the end of home, right? They're moving out of home probably for good. It requires some sort of forced dependence on other people for the basic needs of life, a loss of a sense of purpose maybe. It leads to loneliness and social isolation often, some anxiety. So long-term care is just a hard topic to deal with, even without considering one lick of finances. It's just hard to think of from a human perspective. But then, of course, there is the financial portion. Long-term care is ridiculously expensive. How expensive? Well, depending on your level of care, costs between $5,000 a month and $20,000 a month are very much normal. So that's between $60,000 a year and $250,000 a year. But wait, there's more, because depending on the source you look at, somewhere between 50 to 70% of 65-year-old adults will need some form of long-term care before they die. Women are more likely to need long-term care than men, with an average stay somewhere around 3 years for women and somewhere around 2 years for men. In other words, some retirees are going to need $0 of long-term expenses in their life, while other retirees could easily surpass $500,000, $500,000 of long-term care expenses in their life. That's a crazy dispersion. When faced with such an expensive and risky coin flip in that way, one of the common ways to de-risk yourself involves insurance. And sure enough, long-term care insurance is a real product meant for just these kind of situations. But long-term care insurance is very controversial. And I'm going to pull some paragraphs right now from a wonderful KKF article. I'll link it in the show notes. KKF is a healthcare think tank, and I use various articles and tools and calculators of theirs all the time. I highly recommend, if you've never been to the KKF website, I highly recommend if you're thinking about specifically healthcare and retirement and how they overlap, it's a good website to spend a few minutes on. And so anyway, now here goes a few paragraphs from an article from the KKF website. Take, for example, the story of the Jemmett family from Sacramento. For 35 years, Angela Jemmett and her 5 brothers paid premiums on a long-term care insurance policy for their now 91-year-old mother. But the policy doesn't cover home health aides whose assistance allows her, the mother, to stay in her Sacramento, California bungalow near her friends and neighbors who she loves. Her family pays $4,000 a month out of pocket for that. The private insurance market has proved wildly inadequate in providing financial security for most of the millions of older Americans who might need home health aides, assisted living, or other types of assistance with daily living. For decades, the industry, again, that's the insurance industry, severely underestimated how many policyholders would use their coverage, how long they would live, and how much their care would cost. Repeated government efforts to create a functioning market for long-term care insurance or to provide public alternatives have never taken hold. Today, most insurers have stopped selling standalone long-term care policies. The ones that still exist are too expensive for most people, and they've become less affordable each year, with insurers raising premiums higher and higher. Many policyholders face painful choices to pay more, to pare back benefits, or to drop coverage altogether. Okay, so now back to me, back to Jesse and my words. That is a pretty sobering set of paragraphs right there, set of words. And the takeaway is that long-term care insurance is not, unfortunately, a good way to de-risk yourself from long-term care costs and the shock spending risk. So how do we tackle it instead? I've got a couple ideas. They're not exactly easy, but I think it's the best we can do. First, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and admit that long-term care costs almost always come at the end of life, as far out into our financial futures as could possibly be. And if you forced me to put a $500,000 expense somewhere in my financial future, I would choose to put it way out at the end of life, at the end of my financial plan. For example, if you need to make a $500,000 payment in 30 years, and you assume a real rate of return, so that's an inflation-adjusted rate of return of, say, 6%, maybe, right, 9% on the investments minus 3% for inflation. If you assume a rate of return of 6%, then you would need to allocate about $90,000 today in order for it to grow over 30 years to your needed $500,000 in 30 years. Now, don't get me wrong, $90,000 is still a lot of money, but it's not the same as $500,000. And the point here is that time is your friend inside your financial plan, though it might not be your friend, I suppose, when it comes to health itself. But time is your friend inside of your financial plan. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a big proponent of cash flow modeling and asset liability matching. I want to understand the money I'll be spending in the future and ensure that I'm allocating the right amount of dollars today into the right asset class today to grow to what I need it to be in the future. And that brings me to my second point. Speaking of cash flow modeling, in my experience, long-term care isn't purely a new expense. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that the typical retiree might be spending, we can pick a number, might be spending $8,000 a month on their normal lifestyle. And then when they enter long-term care, that $8,000 a month is going to drop down a ton because so much of their normal lifestyle expenses will change. Whatever the circumstances are that merit them going into long-term care are circumstances that mean they're not going to be spending as much money on their normal lifestyle. So maybe their normal expenses drop down from $8,000 a month to $3,000 a month. And yes, now we have to add in a new $10,000 a month line item for long-term care. So their $3,000 a month expenses plus $10,000 for long-term care, that brings the new total to $13,000 a month. But our previous lifestyle expenses were $8,000 a month. The new total is $13,000. So even though the long-term care costs $10,000 a month, technically, this person's expenses only change by $5,000 a month. Most of the time, that kind of tit for tat inside of someone's cash flow ends up being the way reality plays out. Third, I'm going to ask you, what about Medicare and Medicaid? Now, at this point, this is a little funny. I think I've maybe shared this before. I can keep straight Medicare and Medicaid now. At one point, I couldn't keep them straight, and I had to remember that Medicare rhymes with hair, as in white hair, because Medicare is for the elderly, and Medicaid has aid right in the name, as in I don't have money and I need some aid. Medicaid is income needs based. Medicare does not cover long-term care. Technically, there are some hospital recovery scenarios that someone might go through in retirement where roughly the first 100 days of their long-term care-like services are actually covered by Medicare. But again, that's if you're recovering from a hospital stay for about 3 months. It's not the same as when someone potentially needs years of help with simple daily living activities. That's long-term care. But Medicaid can help you with long-term care, though, depending on the state of your personal balance sheet, right? How much assets you have, you might qualify for Medicaid to help you get into and pay for long-term care. Some people, however, don't like this option because you might not get to go into the long-term care facility of your choice. It might feel like a bad facility. And then there's this thing, Medicaid planning for long-term care. It's a very deep and complex topic, too deep for today's episode. You can let me know if you'd like a further deep dive episode into long-term care and Medicaid planning. But the point is that if long-term care is this giant risk, Medicaid planning can potentially be one of the ways to de-risk yourselves of that. So again, if we are going to bring this baby home, how do we de-risk ourselves against shock spending risk and specifically long-term care costs? To me, the answer is kind of simple. We include these costs in our financial plan today. Well, right now, meaning our current plan has to account for the possibility of that major expense many decades into our future. And I think it's worth running an analysis where there's a 100% probability of these costs just to see how it looks. But if you do that, I also think it's equally important to run an analysis where those long-term costs aren't in there at all. Or maybe an analysis where one spouse requires some long-term care and the other one doesn't. These are such big numbers that to assume the worst case across the board is simply more conservative than most of us will need to be. Okay, that was a lot. It was more than maybe I was expecting to talk about, but long-term care and just shock spending in general, it can be, for some families, it can be such a big risk looming on the horizon. I think it's certainly worth planning for today. But that brings us to the next risk of today's episode, cognitive decline risk. And again, here, I'm not going to talk about the health risks of cognitive decline. I'm also not going to talk about the healthcare costs or long-term care costs of cognitive decline, because those are real. But what I really want to talk about is the financial side effects that begin to creep in if someone loses their mental acuity. Stuff like decision-making and the ability to process complex financial information, the ability to evaluate risks and to manage someone's assets properly. You hear stories about people who miss bill payments, messiness and disorganization in their financial life, and then inability to understand basic information. That's a real side effect from cognitive decline. You also hear a lot of stories about susceptibility to scams and exploitation. There's no doubt that cognitive decline increases someone's vulnerability to scams, to fraud, to theft. Billions are already lost every year by older adults who fall victim to scams. I'm really worried about this one personally, especially with some of the things that AI can do. I guess it's hard for me to even explain some of the possibilities. I'm sure I don't even fully understand them myself, but they sound so science fiction-y. But I can foresee a future where unless information is being transmitted face-to-face, it's going to be really difficult to determine if it's real or if it's fraud. Meaning, hearing someone's voice on the phone, even someone who you feel like you know really well, might not be enough to determine if it's actually them, because technology is getting so good at mimicking people's voices. Similarly, and perhaps even more scary, seeing someone's moving face over video on FaceTime, on a Zoom chat, won't be enough to determine if it's actually them. And I know that sounds like sci-fi, but I really don't think it's that far around the corner. And who among us would be most susceptible to that type of scan? They hear a voice or they see a face and they think, oh, that's a person I know. it's probably the people who are the least familiar with the technology, meaning elderly people, and cognitive decline magnifies that risk even more so. That's scary stuff. Cognitive decline is also associated with irrational investment behavior, right? Individuals are going to make drastic shifts in their investment approaches, probably for all the wrong reasons, simply because the knowledge that they maybe once possessed has started to escape them. Then there's also overconfidence in one's ability. People with declining cognitive function often remain overconfident or can grow overconfident in their own abilities, their own financial abilities, despite their impairment. So where do we end up after all these things are combined? We end up with just straight up losses in wealth, irreversible financial errors, duplicate transactions, missed transactions. It's a long list of possibilities. So how do we combat this risk? How do we combat cognitive decline risk? Well, first, there are health-related steps we can take. I'm not a doctor. I'm hesitant to go too deep into detail here. Now, depending on where you look in the health literature, though, there are exercise and cardiovascular interventions. There are diet-related interventions. There are sleep-related interventions too. So anyway, I would say talk to someone who knows more than me about health, but using health is one of the ways to de-risk yourself from cognitive decline. But then what can we actually introduce into our financial plan to help mitigate the risk of cognitive decline? I think it's a simple answer. Backup systems and backup people. The worst outcomes here in the realm of cognitive decline come from when one person, and that person alone, has all the power, controls all the buttons, knows all the information for their financial life, and if that one person starts to slip, there's no backup system in place to bail them out. So what are some of these backup systems? One is establishing legal protections, creating a durable power of attorney document for finances, creating a healthcare proxy for health while you are still competent to ensure that there are trusted individuals in place who can act on your behalf. The second one is to set up trusted contacts. And I say that in quotes because the exact terminology can change from custodian to custodian. But a lot of custodians, meaning Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, whoever, they have this idea of a trusted contact where you can notify that financial institution of a trusted contact person who could be alerted if unusual activity suggests maybe that you're the victim of some sort of financial abuse, financial fraud, or maybe you're starting to slip up to cognitive decline. The third idea I have is to simplify and automate your finances. Consolidate your bank accounts, set up automated bill payments to avoid a missed payment, set up a Social Security advance designation if you don't have that for representative payees. Get organized. That's the fourth idea. Compile a secure, accessible list of assets, insurance policies, passwords, all the important documents, your estate documents. Really get organized and then let a second person understand what organization you've done, where it is if something happens to you, kind of let them in on at least some of those secrets, for lack of a better term. The fifth idea is to establish a team of trusted advisors. Now, I was talking to my wife literally today as I was writing out the script for this episode, and we had a little side conversation about who she should reach out to if I got hit by a bus. And it made me realize here we are at age 36, and I need to put down in writing for her some things that she doesn't know. And I owe it to her to let her know who wrote our estate documents, who our insurance agent is for life insurance, who our accountant is, who I would contact as a financial planner to help her if I got hit by that bus, which of our friends and family I would share questions with if I were in her shoes. So again, that's how you de-risk yourself from cognitive decline risk. It's all about getting backup systems and backup people in place. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Did you know my written blog, The Best Interest, was nominated for 2022 Personal Finance Blog of the Year, and it's been highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, and on CNBC? I love writing, especially when that writing is to share financial education, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles per week. You can read them all at bestinterest.blog. Again, the web address is bestinterest.blog. Check it out. Now let's move on to behavioral risk. This is a giant risk for investors of all stripes. And the risk here is that your own emotional, irrational, biased decision-making, as opposed to kind of logical analysis, will lead to financial missteps that jeopardize what would otherwise be a comfortable retirement. And I think for retirees in particular, this risk is amplified by other fears. I won't spend a ton of time talking about the individual possible behaviors, but you might be familiar with them already. Stuff like loss aversion, recency bias, herd mentality, overconfidence, the status quo bias, how these very human, but also sometimes illogical tendencies can get us to do objectively bad stuff like timing the market or panic selling and the like. So how do we combat behavioral risk? Well, the first thing I think of is to automate our cash flow, right? Set up automatic, consistent withdrawals, like a direct deposit from a retirement account into a checking account, rather than making manual, emotional decisions to withdraw money. A second thing you can do is to think of buckets. Now, you don't have to use a quote-unquote bucket strategy to build your portfolio. You don't have to do that. But I think you should realize that there are various assets that you own, and these assets do have certain tendencies that place them into shorter-term or longer-term quote-unquote buckets. And if your longer-term bucket is behaving with extra volatility, you can ignore it because that's the long-term bucket, and you don't need to worry about it for years, if not decades. So whether you want to use the bucket metaphor or something else, it's simply important to realize that the different assets you own inside of a diversified portfolio are usually there, at least in some part, because they have different timelines associated with them, different levels of volatility associated with them, and sometimes your certain assets are simply going to be more volatile than others. That's by design, right? That's by design. And so as long as you think about it that way, it can kind of help you realize that some of the concern that you feel about volatility is, again, what do they say? It's a feature. It's not a bug. Number 3, create a written investment policy statement or IPS. It's a formal plan that outlines how to react during market volatility to prevent knee-jerk, fear-driven sales. I think of it as kind of a break glass in case of market panic. That's what you do. When things are getting tough and you're getting worried, you can whip out the IPS that you wrote when you were of sound mind, that you wrote when everything was calm. And you can almost remind yourself of, oh yeah, that's right. Here are the reasons why I made the portfolio I made. And if you adhere to that plan rather than to reacting to news headlines, you'll be better off for it. You can set your portfolio to automatically rebalance if you want to, or you can set that up inside your IPS, how often you rebalance. And that forces you to sell high and buy low rather than selling into fear. I think the 4th thing on my list is to limit how much you monitor your accounts. If you check your portfolio balance too frequently, especially during market volatility, during panicky times, well, that can lead to panic selling or just bad investor behavior in general. And number 5 is to remove yourself as best you can. For most of us, we are our own worst enemies. And if you feel the urgent need to do something drastic, it's really helpful if some little Jiminy Cricket voice in the back of your mind convinces you just to pause. If you feel like you can't help yourself though, well, maybe you can't and you need to outsource it to someone who can. And we already discussed it here. Automate as much as you can. Automate. Remove yourself if you need to as much as you can. And whether, like I said, whether it's that Jiminy Cricket voice in the back of your head, whether it's a trusted friend or family member who can convince you to remove yourself, or whether it's leaning on a professional, trying to automate and remove yourself from the decisions is almost always a good thing as opposed to a bad thing. Now, the thing about behavior risk is that by the time you realize that it's hurt you or that it's hurting you, it might already be too late. Now, for example, you could have gotten your ducks in a row in 2015. That's the year we'll pick here. And you've been in a really good spot. All your systems are smooth. And then March of 2020 happens. You get scared. You do something that only afterward you realize was stupid. And that's behavior risk. And the thing is, you might not have realized it during the panic of the spring of 2020 when COVID was hitting in March of 2020. But by the time things calm down and you realize it, it's too late. So anyway, that's why behavior risk, by the time you realize it, that it's hurt you, it might be too late. You really want to get your anti-behavior risk systems set up early. It can undo so much important work that you've already done. So set up those systems, automate what you can, remove yourself where you can to help you mitigate behavior risk. And next, let's pivot to assumptions risk. And I want to break this one down into 2 small sub-risks. The first one involves the assumptions you're making about your future self. And the second one involves the assumptions you're making about the future world. And specifically here, I mean the assumptions about market returns and inflation and tax policy, the very assumptions that create your retirement projections in the first place. And the idea of knowing your future self, it's a very kind of deep academic psychology topic where, again, I am not an expert, don't consider myself an expert. But when I read about it, the big takeaways are that, okay, humans are generally inaccurate at predicting their future emotional states. We consistently overestimate both the intensity and the duration of our future emotions. And number 2, we tend to project current preferences, moods, and feelings onto our future selves. For example, a person who is currently full of food, they had a big meal, they are actually worse at predicting how hungry they will be while grocery shopping later on than someone who is currently hungry. We use our current preferences and moods and feelings and project them onto our future self. Number 3, we tend to focus too narrowly on single future events while ignoring daily routines and other mundane contexts that will influence our emotional states. Number 4, we fail to recognize that the human brain has an unconscious ability to rationalize, cope, and adapt to negative events. And that makes those negative events feel less devastating in the moment than we currently anticipate them to be. And then number 5, we quickly return to a baseline level of happiness after major positive or negative life events. Because we underestimate this adaptation that we have, we incorrectly believe things that, winning the lottery will bring us lasting happiness, or that a relationship breakup will bring lasting misery. You might be familiar with this one, listeners. It's called the hedonic treadmill. And anyway, my point is that if you assume that retirement will fundamentally change who you are as a person or fix the problems in your life, if you see retirement as a hammer whose job it is to pound in the various nails that surround you, you might be at risk of some pretty poor assumptions. And the solution here, I think, is kind of to know yourself, right? So how do you de-risk yourself? I would recommend some self-study. For example, two books that immediately come to mind are Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert, and then Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman. I'll link to those two books in the show notes. But basically, in order to not make bad assumptions about your future self, it's really helpful to know who you are and know how your brain works, and maybe educate yourself just on how human brains work in general, especially when it comes to predicting who we will be in the future. So that's the thought process there. But now let's pivot to the assumptions you're making about the future world. And specifically, again, I mean market returns and tax policy and inflation, the very assumptions that create your retirement projections. And this is a place where I constantly and consistently see mistakes from both DIYers and professionals alike. And I see 5 major assumption categories that retirees need to consider, at least when it comes to kind of the long-term cash flow portfolio projection, the Monte Carlo projection type thing. There are 5 categories that we need to consider. They are Social Security, investment returns, expenses and other cash flow, inflation, and tax rates. And the risk here is that you assume unrealistic numbers in those 5 major categories. Because when you do that, these numbers, they don't just add, they multiply, they compound inside your retirement plan. And any lack of realistic numbers is going to make your final answers even further from the truth than they ought to be. Now, what do I mean specifically? Well, a very conservative person might say the following 5 things. Again, very conservative. On Social Security, I'm assuming it's not even going to be there at all. It won't even exist anymore. On investment returns, I could say, well, historically, a 60-40 portfolio might return 9% a year. I'm going to assume, 6 or 7% a year. Let's just plant a flag and say 6.5% per year. On expenses, I know that most people's nominal spending actually goes down in retirement, or there's a lot of good research about the retirement spending smile, they call it, because the graph kind of looks like a smile. But actually, I want to be safe, and I'm going to assume that my spending will go up in retirement. Maybe I'm convinced I'm going to travel a lot. So I'm going to assume that my spending goes up by 25% a year. On inflation, historically, it's been 3%. I'm just going to assume 5%. I mean, after all, 2022 and 2023 had really high inflation. And then for taxes, I'm going to assume federal tax rates are going up in the future. I mean, why not make that assumption? And so I'm going to assume my personal tax rates will increase, and I'm going to use a 20% effective tax rate. Now, we all know that conservative assumptions are naturally going to lead to conclusions that ask you to work more years, to save more money, to spend less money. That's just a natural consequence of financial planning conservatism. But for this specific person with these 5 very conservative assumptions, I can almost guarantee that these assumptions are costing them 10 to 15 years of additional work. In other words, if this person was simply realistic, they might be able to retire at age 60, but their assumptions would ask them to work into their 70s. And I know this is true because I ran all the numbers, and you can check it out for yourself in probably one of the more viral articles I've ever written called The Crushing Cost of Conservative Retirement Planning, and we will link to that in the show notes. But when it comes to assumption risk, retirees can also be too aggressive with their assumptions, and I think that's a big risk too. I think loss aversion, speaking of behavioral risk, the loss aversion in our brains suggests that being too aggressive is the bigger and scarier risk. What if I assume a 9% return on my portfolio, but then I only get a 7% return, and then I'm forced to re-enter the workforce at age 80? That is a little bit scary. So, what's the best practice here when it comes to assumptions risk? First and foremost, you need to be aware that conservatism compounds. Well, and I guess being too aggressive, that compounds too. These assumptions, they all multiply together, they all compound. Now, what I mean is that if you had 5 inputs to a math problem, and those inputs all multiply together and compound, and you choose to be 25% conservative with each of those 5 inputs, then your final answer is actually going to be 200% too conservative. Why? Because 25 times 25 times 25, if you do that 5 times, your final answer is 200%. Now, instead, if you do want to add some conservatism, which is okay, simply to maybe create some bookends or at least just understand what a conservative outcome might look like, you want to do your multiplication the normal way and then only add on 25% at the very, very end. You want to use the most realistic numbers that you can throughout your math such that your final answer is, as far as you know, totally realistic. And then you tack on your conservative margin, if you will, onto your final number. So instead of being 200% too conservative, you're only 25% too conservative. Now, when this topic comes up, you might hear the term base rates, and it's important. Per the dictionary, base rates are the fundamental probability of an event occurring within a specific population, often established through historical data or observation. Base rates are crucial because they provide an accurate starting point for forecasting and decision-making. So 99% of the time, listeners, assumption risks occur because somebody is tampering with the base rates. History says a 60-40 portfolio will provide a 9% annualized return over the long run with an annual volatility of 10%. Great. That's your base rate. Now, if you decide to reduce that rate of return to 8% and you decide to increase the volatility to 15%, you are now tampering with the base rate. You're putting your thumb on the scale. You're layering your brain's need for conservatism on top of objective reality. And that's a risky practice and in general, a bad practice, a suboptimal practice. Now, one little side note, one more point though, because someone might ask, well, what if I have a really good reason to edit a base rate? And okay, maybe there can be some good reasons to edit your personal base rates as being different from the historical precedent or the global base rate. For example, we already discussed back on last week's episode 140, that your personal longevity, the age that you die at, might just be the most important number in your retirement plan. And your lifespan, your personal lifespan, will almost assuredly be different than the average lifespan. And I think it does make sense for you to attempt to discern why you specifically might live longer or shorter than the average. I think that's fair. Another one, we've discussed at length on prior podcast episodes why the 4% rule is probably not the thing that you want to base your entire retirement future on. But at one point, it was a pretty reasonable base rate. So the point there being that base rates can change. How about another one? What if analyses? So again, your base case for retirement, your base case should be based on the base rates. And that's actually a line from my upcoming Dr. Seuss retirement book called Oh, the Places You'll Nap. But of course, you probably should then run some what-if analyses. For example, on the Social Security front, we've discussed here that the current path to Social Security does actually have retiree benefits going down to something like 80% of what's been promised as of 2034 and 2035. Yes, that's kind of a political suicide for Congress, but you might want to ask yourself, what if Congress doesn't step up to the plate and do something about this? So, okay, if it's a what-if analysis and you're adjusting the base rate to understand that, I think that's fair. Anyway, assumptions risk, a very good risk to be aware of and a very good one to try to make sure that your numbers are as accurate as possible. Next, we have policy, legislation, and tax risk. And yes, we just talked about Social Security. It's time to talk about Social Security again, because the biggest kind of sub-risks that fall under the overhead umbrella of legislation and policy and tax risk are Social Security, tax rates themselves, Medicare, RMDs, inflation, I actually think belongs in here in a way, and I'll explain that. And then for an honorable mention, number 6, maybe we can throw the estate tax in there too. So for some more specifics, Social Security, we did just discuss that a little bit. The main risk here is that somehow our benefits decrease in a way that we're currently not planning for. Taxes, we are living in a historically low tax regime. It's conceivable that we could live through increases to income taxes, capital gains taxes, dividend tax treatment is really nice right now. We could see that retirement accounts are somehow treated differently in the future, or that state level taxation of retirement income changes. In most states, maybe in all states, I actually don't know this. I know here in New York State, Social Security income isn't taxed. What if that changes? Anyway, so taxes could change. For Medicare, I think about the 65-year-old eligibility age, the premiums themselves for Part D and Part B and D, boy and dog, they have premiums, coverage changes, out-of-pocket costs. Again, the idea is that could legislation somehow change our access to Medicare and what it does for us? On the RMD front, we've recently seen the RMD age change from 70 and a half to 72 to 73, and it's soon to be 75 years old. We've also seen a lot of changes when it comes to inherited IRAs over recent years. Number 5, inflation policy is a very interesting one. It's a little nerdy, but fiscal policy, so-called fiscal policy, is set by Congress, whereas monetary policy is determined by the Fed, Federal Reserve. And for the most part, inflation is related to and controlled by monetary policy. Whereas, Congress will certainly hear your frustration if they pass fiscal policy that negatively affects you. They might not change anything, but at least you can access your local congressperson to complain. The Fed is much less likely to care about your personal hardship if they enact monetary policy that raises inflation and hurts your retirement plan. And then last, estate taxes. This only affects a small portion of people right now, at least on the federal level. Probably more of you are affected at your personal state level when it comes to estate taxes. But either way, these rules are certainly subject to change, and that's really the risk here. Someone might be all set with their estate taxes right now, only to find that some change that occurs in 10 or 20 years might totally screw up their retirement plans. So what can you do about policy risk? I think most retirement plans are built on a set of uncertain markets plus stable rules. We consider uncertain markets, but we think of the rules as being stable. And going back to a couple minutes ago, I think that should be the base rate. I think it's okay and even good to assume stable rules. And the reason there is that to predict the instability in the rules, I think is way too much of a crystal ball exercise than is merited, right? I cannot predict the future, and we shouldn't be in the business of predicting the future. But I think we can be realistic and admit that policies have changed before and probably will change again. We don't know if they'll change in our favor or change against us, but I think it's okay to assume that they'll change again. And I think it's okay if in our planning, we ask those what if questions, right? The base rate reflects reality. The base plan reflects reality. But then we ask some what if questions that might involve uncertain rules. What if my Social Security benefit does decline by 20%? What if my effective tax rate does go up by 5%? Those kind of things. And I think those are fair questions, certainly worth understanding the answers to. But again, it doesn't mean that those answers belong in your base rate assumptions. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you. And now let's get to our second to last risk today. We're going to dive into identity and purpose risk. There are entire books, entire websites, entire podcasts, just a big body of work dedicated to this one topic. And, the idea here is you don't want to retire from something, you want to retire to something. You want to think about all the positive things you get from work and ask yourself how you'll replace those things in retirement. You want to think about, the structure of your days and the social interactions and status that you get at work and how you are made to feel useful in your life. Here's a fun one. Think about all those phrases that currently maybe, or used to be when you were working, they're in the form of I am a blank, or I do blank, or I help people with blank. And when you retire, all those phrases become past tense. I used to be blank. Oh, back when I was working, I did blank. Oh yeah, I used to help people with that back in the day. Is it Marlon Brando in that movie On the Waterfront?
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum, which is what I am. Let's face it.
The point here is that a lot of retirees struggle with their identity and the purpose that they didn't realize they are missing until it's too late. It might have, and usually does, come from work in some way, shape, or form. And anyway, many retirees struggle with that. And I think the takeaway, or at least the solution, is that it takes legitimate work to mitigate identity and purpose risk. Mental work, thought. It takes legitimate thought. Back on episode 106 of this podcast, I spent most of that episode talking about just this topic. The episode is called The Big Disconnect: Pre-Retiree Expectations versus Retirement Reality. I think there's the one stat from that episode that I come back to time and time again, which is that the average pre-retiree ranks finances as their top concern, but the average post-retiree, finances is something like number 6. And all of their top concerns as an actual retiree, as a post-retiree, almost all of their top concerns have to do with identity and purpose. But back in that episode, I talked about 3 exercises you can do to help on this front. They're called the Perfect Day exercise, the Ikigai map exercise, and then the rocking chair test. So I highly recommend you go check out that episode and make sure you've done all 3 exercises if retirement is kind of on your horizon. Purpose and identity risk is the driver behind why retirement increases the probability of depression by about 40%. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Most people probably assume retirement is like an extended vacation, right? Free time, travel, tennis, seeing the family, doing crosswords on a calm morning, a hot coffee in hand, loons calling to each other in the distance on the lake. I mean, that is what people think about in retirement. And how could that image elicit more depression than the 9-to-5 grind. So clearly, what I'm saying is that many of our assumptions about retirement must be misplaced, just not meshing with the actual realities of retirement. And I think that purpose and identity risk are probably a really big reason why. So anyway, that is an important thought process when it comes to purpose and identity risk. And that brings us to the final risk of this 2-episode series, which are called the deep risks. Now, many people put Bill Bernstein on their Mount Rushmore of investment communicators. He mostly does writing, along with the Warren Buffetts and the John Bogles and the Jason Zweigs of the world. Bernstein's most well-known books are probably The 4 Pillars of Investing, The Intelligent Asset Allocator. He has a really short book, I think it's only 15 or 16 pages long, called If You Can, and it's targeted toward, I believe, investment beginners. He also has a couple interesting books that are more about economic history, A Splendid Exchange, and The Birth of Plenty. But in 2013, he wrote a book only 56 pages long, and it's called Deep Risk: How History Informs Portfolio Design. And Bernstein's main point in that book, Deep Risk, is that standard investment strategy, this kind of stuff that we talk about here, to be candid, the kind of stuff that almost all personal finance and investing content talks about, looks at relatively short-term volatility and thinks about bear markets that last, a few months, maybe a couple years, 3-4 years, that kind of thing. But Bernstein says that real-world investors are subjected to sometimes long horizon perils that we ought to be much more focused on. These perils can stem from both economic and military concerns, and they can actually cause sometimes multi-decade hiccups in our retirement plans, which, let's be honest, multi-decade might just be the full tenure of your retirement plan in the first place. And these perils are what he would call deep risks. And Bernstein writes, these risks have names: inflation, deflation, confiscation, and devastation. And any useful discussion of portfolio design incorporates their probabilities, consequences, and costs of mitigation. Now, we already talked about inflation as one of our major 14 risks. That was last week on episode 140. So I'll leave inflation there. But let's talk about deflation, confiscation, and devastation real quick. If we're going to discuss deflation, we probably should just look at the Great Depression. Falling prices, collapsing demand, a financial system that's under stress. Whereas inflation makes you want to invest all of your cash, right? Deflation is where cash is king. So how do we combat deflation? You probably want to hold some high quality bonds and cash. You want to maintain your liquidity. You want to avoid excess leverage if you can. Then again, right, deflation has almost never happened. It's really only happened in one consequential way here in the US. But that's part of Bernstein's point, is that these deep risks are very damaging when they occur. They can occur over a long timeline when they occur, but they're also kind of rare. And that's part of the really hard part about deep risk, is like, how do you handle something that, if it occurs, could really screw you up, but it's just probably not going to occur? That's a hard problem. But anyway, we'll come back to this idea. I told you it's a hard problem. Bernstein has some thoughts on that I'll share with you at the end. But first, let's talk about confiscation as a topic. And it tends to make people a little uncomfortable. If we zoom out to a global perspective, history is full of governments who change the rules, or just large institutions who change the rules. Sometimes it might just be higher taxes. Sometimes it might be asset seizures or like nationalization. Confiscation is a risk that someone more powerful than you changes the rules to your disadvantage. So how do we combat this risk? Bernstein admits it's not easy and at times not even worth doing. In other words, it might be one of those risks that we simply have to live with. But we certainly want to diversify across jurisdictions if it's easy. We want to hold assets from different parts of the world. And if you want to really get crazy, and it's certainly crazier than anything I have done or am doing, you could even choose to custody your assets in different jurisdictions. I guess that means, have a brokerage account in the US and in Switzerland and in Japan. I don't know. Like I said, it's too much complexity for me, but technically it does reduce your exposure to confiscation risk in one particular country. And that leaves us with the last one, devastation risk. War, revolution, societal collapse, situations where entire markets are wiped to zero, or where your citizens' property rights are simply erased. Those are probably situations where, frankly, financial planning doesn't even really matter anymore. Now, if your home, your country, your society collapses, I'm not sure there's much you can do, but it's possible that in a globally diversified portfolio, that some portion of your investment holdings do go through some form of devastation. I think, as an example, you could look at the country of Venezuela over recent decades. The really 30,000-foot highlights or lowlights, the oil industry in Venezuela grew and grew and grew until partially in the 1970s, and then it kind of finished off in the early 2000s, led by Hugo Chavez. The oil companies in Venezuela had their assets seized by the government and were basically forced out. That's nationalization. Maybe that's not a devastation risk, right? Maybe that's certainly more of a confiscation risk. But then I guess you could say what's going on in Venezuela today is much more similar to a devastation risk than anything else. And certainly the oil nationalization and what happened there was a bit of a preceding event to what's occurring today in modern Venezuela. It's not good. Now, assuming you listening that you're not Venezuelan, these events probably don't impact you too much in your day-to-day. But as a globally diversified investor, yeah, you probably had some exposure to these energy companies when Venezuela kicked them out. And you might have some exposure to some side effects of some of the devastation that's going on in Venezuela. It's probably a small exposure that you have because Venezuela is a relatively small country, but that risk is there. Now, the big insight when it comes from Bernstein's wisdom on the deep risks is that no single asset protects you from all the risks, let alone from all the deep risks, right? We talked about 14 different risks over these last 2 episodes. Stocks help with some risks, but stocks actually expose you to other risks. Bonds help with deflation, but bonds get eaten alive by inflation. Global diversification helps out, but not perfectly. Some risks are totally out of your hands. Some risks are deeply personal, tied to our health or tied to our happiness. Some risks are tied to markets. Some are tied to the government. Some are tied to the other people in our lives, right? There's no silver bullet when it comes to combating all these risks. But I hope that this exercise over the last 2 episodes has helped you conceptualize these 14 unique risks that I think most retirees face or could face, and has given you some ideas about what you might address in your personal retirement plan, maybe where some of the holes are, maybe as Charlie Munger would have said, show me where I'm going to die to make sure I never go there. I've shown you a lot of the risks that could face you in your retirement. Now it's up to you to decide if you're exposed to that risk or what you can do to quote unquote never go there. So thank you as always for listening to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.